Imagine a hotel wardrobe you pull open at midnight and find not jackets, but a hidden room, bigger than the closet itself. In the center of that narrow secret space sits an old hospital gurney, the straps still buckled as if someone had been left there in a hurry. 10 chilling true ghost stories from around the world, each a small life interrupted by the impossible. Content warning: these are claimed true accounts submitted by listeners. They include encounters with apparitions, sleep-related phenomena, and unexplained physical movement. If topics like uncanny presences or sleep paralysis are sensitive for you, consider listening later. These are submissions, unverified claims told by people who lived them. I'm Mort. I read and collect these stories the way some people collect postcards, little scenes of other lives folded into a voice message or an email. Tonight, we cross bedrooms, hotel hallways, country mansions and temple courtyards, Italy, Finland, Brazil, Romania and more. These are not proof, they are reports. What a person felt, smelled, heard and could not explain. If one of these lands on you, stay with it until the end. If you like these deep dives into the uncanny, like and subscribe. There are more where these came from. Italy, this summer. A student studying abroad, submitted by Elena. Imagine being 20, living in a creaky pension near Florence, and finding that the house keeps secrets of its own. Elena says the pensione felt like most budget places in Italy. Narrow staircases that smelled faintly of old soap and vinegar, a landlady who swept with the same broom every morning, and guests who came and went like actors between scenes. Her room was small, the wallpaper peeling in one corner, a wardrobe shoved against the wall that jammed sometimes if you tried to close it too quickly. It was the sort of place where every knock and every draft has a provenance you can usually figure out. An open window, a neighbor, a bus slamming a door on the street below. But one night she pulled the wardrobe doors and found behind a false backboard a tight space large enough to stand in. In the middle, as if placed for an audience, sat a foundling of an object, an old hospital gurney, metal, frosting the slats with rust and leather straps buckled like a patient waiting for a doctor who never arrived. The first time she noticed it, she thought it was a movie prop someone had left. She propped the wardrobe open and took a picture, tongue-in-cheek. Later that night, with the air thick and the city quiet, she opened the wardrobe again, just to look, and when she pushed the edge of the gurney to sit the chair she'd brought from the corridor, it shifted. Not sliding like a rug being tugged, but a violent, jarring heave as if something heavy shoved its way under the slats. Elena says she nearly dropped her phone and remembers the smell then, a metallic, chemical tang in the air, like the inside of a long-closed clinic. It felt alive, she told me. It felt like it had been sat on. She woke the other guests in a half-panic. 2 friends came, bleary and incredulous, and the 3 of them watched. The gurney didn't move again by itself then, but later, when she fell asleep on the floor of the wardrobe because she was too afraid to go back to bed, her friend Lucas swore the gurney rolled on its own across the secret room, like it had a mind. When the landlady was shown the photograph and the gap in the wardrobe, she frowned and said wood sometimes shifts in old houses, that the house had been a clinic during the war, that the memory of rooms could be sticky. But Eleanor's room had never been a clinic on the official maps of the building. The landlady's denial scraped against Eleanor's gut the way an old bandage might. What followed was a small catalogue of domestic anomalies, tucks of bedding that seemed disturbed, though she'd slept on a chair, the sound of a wheeled frame scraping across the narrow floor late at night. Once, the sound of straps snapping as if someone tried to wriggle free. Elena took both prosaic and superstitious steps. She kept the wardrobe closed and placed a chair in front of it as if to block a door. She tried to rationalize the smell and the sounds, old pipes, a neighboring guest's wheeled suitcase, but the sensation of weight stayed with her, a pressing sensation at the base of her skull whenever she stood in the doorway. She moved rooms after 2 weeks. The police were never called. No one was injured. The landlady later told her the pension had been home to an infirmary decades earlier, an explanation that fit, even if it didn't account for the straps and the sudden, purposeful movement. The aftermath for Elena was quiet and persistent. She stopped sleeping on her back for months. She developed an almost ritualistic habit of patting the mattress before she sat, checking that no weight pressed down where no person lay. She still travels, but when she walks past vacant closets now, she does it differently, slower, aware that some storage simply remembers what was placed inside it. The gurney, whoever it once held, remained a ghost at the edge of her travels. When I asked her what she thought it was, she laughed, short, startled, and said, "I don't know, but it wanted to be seen. If thresholds can hold residue, then bedrooms can keep it tight against your chest." That idea threads us to the next story. A sleep space that seemed to breed paralysis rather than rest. Finland, 1950s apartment building, submitted by Mika. A series of narrow, functional sentences and a chill wind that slips under closed windows. Mika's building was one of those Soviet-era boxy things. Sturdy concrete, too many angles, corridors that smelled faintly of coffee and winter boots. In his tiny alcove bedroom, the bed tucked into a small recessed nook, he began waking with that old, impossible pressure, a weight across his chest, like someone sitting down hard. It wasn't a gradual thing. He fell asleep, and then, always within the first hour, woke to his breath slowing and an absence of motion in his limbs. He knew about sleep paralysis, words whispered in medical forums and underlit bed covers, and he'd read that one could be seized by the muscle-locking sleep state where the mind wakes and the body does not. Yet what he submitted was not an argument for or against diagnosis. It was the feeling that something was in the room. The first night, he described a cool breeze that bypassed the radiator entirely and moved through the alcove from left to right, though every window and every vent was sealed. He felt a pressure on his sternum and smelled something faintly floral, like the perfume of a woman his grandmother once described wearing to church, mixed with dust. The air around his face seemed thick, as if the kitchen soup of the building had tipped and pooled right there. He could hear a whisper, not words at first, more like a movement of syllables behind his ear. He writes that he couldn't scream, not because his throat failed, but because an immovable decision had been made in his chest. Wait. On the third week, he changed the layout of his alcove. The bed moved away from the niche into the center of the room so that there were openings to his left and right. The episode stopped. He submitted this detail plainly, moving the bed, fixed it. He didn't claim to have exorcised anything. He said simply, "The place where I slept mattered." There's a practical explanation, of course. Sleep paralysis often shows up in sleeping arrangements that position the head near a wall, in rooms that promote certain sleep cycles, or in stressed bodies. Mika allowed all those explanations in his own telling. He also added a small note that gives the story its weight. Occasionally, months later, when he visited his old apartment to retrieve a box, he stood for a moment in the alcove and felt the exact temperature shift he had felt during the episodes, a coolness that suggested the space itself retained a pattern even after his body had left. "As if the room still remembered how to press," he said. He now sleeps with the lamp on, and he sometimes travels with a small vial of lavender he rubbed at his temples if he feels anxious. "That's not a cure," he admits. "It's a habit born of an unprovable encounter. Whether it was the architecture or the something else lingers as an open question in his tone. Sleep is a vulnerable border, and sometimes that border is breached by the visible, a ball of white light, a presence that wakes an entire family." From an alcove in Finland, we travel south to Oroto, Brazil, where the family's room became a place of persistent nightly disturbance. Oroto, Brazil, late 2000s, submitted by a listener who asked to be anonymous. The house in Oroto sits under a heavy sky and a canopy of mango trees. The listener describes a wide wooden porch that collects the smell of sugarcane in the wet season, and a bedroom with high ceilings, and a fan that throws slow shadows against the walls. For months, what began as small domestic oddities, an ornament knocked off a shelf, a plate that slid 3 inches on a counter, ratcheted into something that would not let the family sleep. It started with a white, ball-like shape that would appear in the corner of the room when the lights were off. Sometimes it hovered for a few seconds and drifted away. Other times it rolled across the floor like a moth too big for the space. The narrator wrote, "At first we thought it was a trick of the fan or light, but then my little brother started to scream. The brother would wake with fingers pressed to his chest, claiming something had been sitting on him. Objects began to fall without cause. An entire book toppling from the shelf at 2 in the morning, a glass sliding off a bedside table as if nudged. The most disturbing episodes were auditory. The family heard knocks in tempo on the outside wall, the kind of knocking that anyone would answer if someone did it late at night, and sometimes heard whispering just beyond comprehension. On one occasion, a scream unlike any of their own erupted from the room and ricocheted down the hall. The parents' doors flung open, found everyone in place, sheets tangled but no one physically harmed. The banging, the whispering, the white light. Together they made a grammar of the uncanny that felt purposeful and directed only at one room. Visitors who slept elsewhere in the house reported nothing. What made the events more unnerving was the unanimity of experience. This wasn't one person's sleep-torn narrative. The whole family heard it. The mother, the father, both children, collating their memories into one fuller, less explainable image. They tried to test it. They slept in shifts, swapped rooms, burned incense, and once placed a jar of salt by the doorway. The jar was found half empty the next morning. No explanation. They replaced light bulbs, checked wiring, and asked a neighbor if she had been by. She had not. A local elder suggested a spiritual cause, and the family, raised with a mixture of Catholic and older folk practices, performed prayers and left offerings on the porch. For a short while, the nights quieted, but the pattern returned months later with fresh intensity. The aftermath for this family included a practical decision. They stopped sleeping in that room. They moved the children to the living room and installed a new lock on the bedroom door. The narrator's tone when recounting this is both weary and resigned. They have learned to treat the night as a contested zone. There is a lingering fear, a habit of checking corners with a phone light before entering. Perhaps the most haunting line they sent was a simple question: why did it choose only that room? The next story takes a different register. A childhood vision of a solid black kneeling woman, remembered decades later with a tenderness and a scar. Brazil, early 1990s. Submitted by Pau. Pau writes with the unruly clarity of someone who still feels the edges of a childhood memory. In his telling, the house was tactile, the heat of afternoon tiles, the smell of frying plantain that clung to the kitchen door, the soft squeak of the bed when you shifted. He was 7. He says he woke up one night to find a figure kneeling at his bedside. Not a blurred suggestion of a person, not a trick of a lamp. It was a dense, black silhouette, shaped into the posture of someone in prayer, solid and matte, as if it had swallowed the light. He remembers the weight of the sight, more than anything, the presence of a shape so black it seemed to absorb his small lamp's glow. He couldn't cry. The sound stuck like a stone. When his sister later woke with a hand-shaped mark on her shoulder, they blamed each other for playing pranks. No pranks were confessed. Pau's youth held the image like a bruise. As he grew older, he encountered the term shadow person online and in books. Figures reported in many cultures, sometimes described as watchers, sometimes as predators. Pau avoids labels. He prefers the simple chronology, the kneeling figure, the sister's mark. The nights their mother said were sleepless. Once he was a teenager, he confided in a cousin who said their grandmother had once told of a woman of the house who watched over births and deaths. Pao keeps that phrase in mind now, partly because it comforts and partly because it complicates the memory. A protective visitor who sat in vigil or something else entirely. The mark on his sister's shoulder faded, and their family carried on. But Pao admits the image left him with a kind of permanent vigilance. He doesn't like sleeping with his back to a doorway. He says sometimes when he walks past a window at night, he sees a blackness at the edge of his periphery and reflexively checks the bed. He has not returned to the house where he saw the figure. The house stands there still, with vines and new paint, its presence smooth and ordinary. Pao ends his submission with an admission that makes the story land softer. He doesn't claim to know whether the figure was good or bad, only that it was persistent, and it left a mark on more than skin. The ordinary can sometimes be shared in a single ghostly glimpse. The next account is quieter, but no less unsettling. A silhouette in a hotel hallway passing toward a locked service door, seen by one partner, felt by the other. Romania, a hotel on a wet autumn night, submitted by Eerie. Eerie situates us in a small hotel outside a town of churches and fog, the kind of place where corridors smell of boiled cabbage and prayer candles. She and her partner were on a cheap weekend escape, a narrow bathroom, a duvet too small for the bed, the hiss of a radiator. The bathroom door was half closed, the light from the hall splitting the room in angled shadow. Eerie stood in the doorway, towel wrapped around her shoulders, when a blur crossed the tile, like someone moving quickly and low. She writes that the movement didn't belong to anyone in the hotel. Lights on adjacent doors were closed, and there was only one service corridor that ran behind the rooms, its staff door kept locked. The blur, she says, was a silhouette. No features, only the outline of a person passing with the speed of habit. It slid across from the locked service door toward the bed where her partner slept, then through the wall. She could not wake him. He slept on, breathing in and out as if nothing had happened. She tried to describe the feeling, the world folding for a moment in on its usual logic, air that suddenly seemed to have weight. When she called the front desk the next morning, the keeper blinked at her and said the staff door had been chained for weeks. No one had been through it that night. The camera in the corridor, they said, had been out of order and would be checked. Eerie asked if anyone else had reported anything. The keeper shook his head, not unkindly, and handed her the hotel receipt. She looked at the image of the night, smeared light and a strip of grainy grain, and felt as if a film had been caught in a projector, that she'd seen something that did not want witnesses. What unsettled her afterwards was not fear so much as the loneliness of the sight. Her partner shrugged it off. Months later, when she mentioned it, he laughed and said hotels make people nervous. Eerie stayed awake several nights after, practicing a small ritual of waking him, touching his shoulder, until she could be sure the outline he cast on the bed was only human. The hotel later closed for renovations, and she wondered in a quiet note whether the staff encountered the same shadow. No one else wrote to confirm. The silhouette remained a private impression that made doors feel thinner when she travelled. We'll pause here for a breath. These stories arrive like knocks at different doors, some at the level of a house, others lodged in the private architecture of sleep. They're claimed experiences, not verdicts. If you're feeling unsettled, remember this is a collection of what people reported. If you've had similar nights, you're not alone. Now past a fog of shared unease, we cross to a different tone altogether. The manicured thresholds of an old German mansion where a physical compulsion becomes an intruding force. Eastern Germany, our nouveau mansion, submitted by a guest who once stayed with friends. The mansion stands at the end of a long lane, brickwork softened by ivy, a high threshold that seems to ask for attention. The family who lived there had long collected oddities, old keys, bent nails, a library of occultist pamphlets folded at the spine. Our submitter, staying for a weekend with a friend, described the day as a sort of nostalgic adventure. Walking the grounds, dust motes catching in shafts of winter sunlight, cats too thin and watchful. The house has a basement that aligns unusually with the main entrance. The layout creates a sense that the front and the cellar are in conversation. On the first night, simple things happened. Doors that resisted a hand, a cold draught that walked along the bottom of a door and then stopped. Later that evening, there was a moment that made the skin on the back of the guest's neck rise. He tried a door, and his hand would not close the handle. He describes a pressure, a physical force that held the handle down from the inside. When he stepped back, the handle stayed depressed, as if pinned. In the kitchen, a cat watched a closed cupboard and hissed at nothing. On 2 separate nights, attempts to pull the door open resulted in the handle staying flat until someone else touched it. Once, the handle was observed to be held down with no one nearby, an invisible weight that kept it in place. The hosts had dabbled in ritual acts, our submitter notes, candles arranged in circles, occult books left open on a table, and there was an atmosphere of curiosity bordering on carelessness. The guest felt an intrusive compulsion to dig in the basement soil, a pull that made him kneel by the cellar wall and scratch at mortar with a fingernail until his fingers bled. On paper it sounds like hysteria. He said he had no explanation, but that the house made small demands on him, and they were not always pleasant. They fled the next morning after the cat scratched across someone's face without a touch, and then retreated to hide under the sofa, saturated with the house's unease. Afterwards, the guest avoided thresholds carved in old stone for a time. He stopped visiting the family and eventually took the train across the country, telling himself that travel is antiseptic. He left with a sense that the house had a will that was not necessarily malicious but demanding. He writes, "It asked," and then leaves the sentence unfinished. The question of what a house might ask from a body is one we rarely entertain until a house indeed insists. We are halfway through this evening's selection, and the stories have already moved between tactile movement, the gurney that pushes, the door handle that will not lift, and the fragile theatre of sleep. There are patterns here, objects as vectors, places that remember bodies. But patterns do not explain singular terror. We press on. France, seaside holiday home, submitted by a family of 7. The house sat on a narrow cliff and smelled of salt and frying fish. All 7 were asleep when, as the family member recounts, there came a deafening crash like a kitchen collapsing. The sound was not a muted thump, but a full-bodied structural noise that set the teeth to trembling in the skull. They ran downstairs in semi-darkness, hearts pumping, to find every dish stacked as it always had been, knives in their blocks, cupboards intact. A cache of dishes sat in exactly the place they were supposed to be. The family searched every room, flung every door open, and found nothing amiss. The sound had been huge and undeniable, yet there was no physical evidence of disturbance. What makes this story unnerving is the unanimity of the experience. 7 people awake at once, all of them describing an implosion. The submitter told me it felt like the house briefly recorded and played back a trauma that had never occurred. Some in the family took comfort in the mundane explanations, an old beam settling, the gales around the cove. Others felt the sound carried an intelligible meaning, a summons or a warning. They could not agree. In the mornings that followed, they took inventory of every fragile thing and locked cabinets with new latches. When nothing else happened, they chalked it up as one of those things households keep for the attic, a story to tell guests and to later argue about. Afterwards, the family developed a habit. At night they left 2 lights on, one in the kitchen and one in the corridor, an attempt to keep the house awake and less inclined to do surprising things. The memory of the crash remained like a bruise beneath the skin of ordinary life. When they later sold the house, the new owners laughed at the story until they told the tale to the neighbor, who frowned and said the cliff had been the site of a collapse 50 years earlier. That was the sort of slim historical detail that does not explain whether the sound was supernatural, but it does plant a deeper sense that places can echo events they once endured. Here is where we will leave the first half of the night. The stories you've heard so far share a common thread, the ordinary becoming uncanny, objects and spaces that seem to store intention, the body as a kind of instrument that rings when rubbed by something unseen. We have not yet reached all the houses, not yet told of shadow people that kneel at children's bedsides beyond Brazil, nor the threshold that repels whole bodies in a German mansion's lower floor, nor the sea-born legends that visited a backpacker on a high-pitched night. But before we press on, notice the small tactics these people use: moving beds, leaving lights on, placing salt by doors. None of them grand rituals, just human responses to the unnerving knowledge that some nights may not belong entirely to the living. The next set of stories will tilt us into older dwellings, maritime myths, and a temple encounter that left a submitter both shaken and unsure whether a stranger had simply provided comfort or something else. We pick up now with another house story that refuses to let its threshold be respected. This time, the tale that ends with a door that insists you keep your hand off the handle. The next house story holds to the theme of a threshold that will not be crossed. This time it's not the handle that's forced down, but a presence that presses itself into the soft architecture of family memory. A listener who grew up in a modest family home, submitted by Anna, sets the scene. A narrow hallway, a mattress that sighed when you turned over, the steady click of a grandfather's cane against linoleum. This is a house that smells of boiled coffee and lemon oil. Sunlight catches dust motes like a slow constellation. Anna's grandfather had slept in the front room for years, a folded blanket and a small radio that never quite went silent. When he died, the household rearranged itself in ways families always do. Chairs shifted, photograph frames tilted to new centers. But something, Anna says, stayed fixed where he had been. It began with small things, the kind of incidents families trade off as quirks. At night, the mattress by the window would crinkle as if someone had sat and folded into it. A radio would come alive to a station with no one at the dial. Footsteps would pad in the hallway at 2 a.m, an inch-perfect mimicry of the cane's rhythm. The dogs would perk, ears pricked, and then slump back down, as if the sound had been a suggestion rather than a fact. Ina remembers lying awake, counting the tiles in the dark and trying to think where the sound had come from. She would tell herself it was her mother or a sibling, but then she would peek through the doorway and see the hallway empty, lit only by a nightlight that made the paint look like flesh. One night, she woke to find pressure on the mattress beside her, not heavy, never heavy, she is careful to say, but enough to bend the bed's edge, to make the springs give a soft complaint. She pushed the sheet away with a fingertip. Nothing. The radio, which had been dead for hours, snicked onto static and then to a slow, mournful station playing an old tune her grandfather used to hum. She called out without thinking, "Grandpa?" And the house held its breath. Nobody answered. Her mother, 2 rooms over, did not move. The phenomena gathered a language, mattresses that crinkled as if someone turned in sleep, soft breathing at the doorway, footsteps that tracked past the kitchen and then stopped at the sound of a child's sob. Once, while Anna was brushing her teeth at dawn, she felt a small hand press into the back of her own wrist, the exact shape and temperature of a hand she had known for years. She turned. There was nobody there. The mark of fingernails she felt faded in minutes, but the sensation lodged in her mind like a sticky note. At first, they treated it as memory made audible, grief drawing familiar patterns into the house's hours. They told stories aloud at the table and laughed until the edges of laughter frayed. They set a place for the grandfather at holiday dinners, as if the seat might soothe something that did not sleep. A visiting neighbor called it the house remembering. An aunt offered pragmatic reasons: pipes, an old heater, the mind making music out of silence. Anna's mother began to leave the radio on low after dusk, perhaps to welcome the old rhythms. For a while that seemed to work, the sounds aligned with something ordinary and harmless. Then there were times that cut through that comfortable reading. On her grandmother's birthday, a night the family had gathered and set out candles, the mattress in the hallway, where nobody in the modern household slept, crinkled with a slow, deliberate pressure. The little radio that sat on the side table clicked to life and started playing the same lullaby the grandfather used to whistle while he folded shirts. No one had touched the radio. The family paused their conversation. The candle's flames bent slightly, though no draught could be found. Someone said a prayer half-finished and then laughed as if to dispel their own unease. Later, Anna found shoe prints in the dust of the back porch, arranged in a small, neat pattern like steps, paused to admire the yard. None of the prints matched the family's sizes. Not all the episodes felt benign. A friend who stayed the night swore she felt the bed tilt and a breath at her ear that was not wind. Her infant cousin woke up screaming one night and insisted, through tears and slurred words, that something had been at her bed, like Grandpa but not him. Anna does not push this into the language of maliciousness. She refuses simple labels. The presence might have been protective and only occasionally clumsy, she suggests. It might have been a memory trying to be present. It might have been something they could never understand. What the family knew for sure was that the house had not gone back to ordinary. Over the years, people did what families do. They adapted. They left the lamp in the hall on for certain nights. They put out a small dish of water by the grandfather's old chair, an offering some neighbor had advised, and sometimes it would be empty in the morning, though no one had used it. Anna's mother began to set a second place at the table on Sundays, verbally addressing it like a person. These were small customs, not a full ritual. They made the house hospitable to whatever threaded itself through the boards. There was one evening, years later, when Anna's sister moved out, and the house took on a quieter, more adult shape. They packed boxes and shifted furniture, and Anna slept in the old front room for the last time. In the middle of the night, she felt that now familiar mattress creak, and the radio tuning into a station that played a hymn she'd not heard since childhood. The pressure at the mattress's edge was gentle this time, like the settling of a hand on a shoulder. Anna whispered, "Good night," without quite knowing to whom. The house answered with the faintest scrape of the cane against tile. No sound that needed to be explained, only a memory of rhythm, and then all settled. The aftermath of these episodes is not a narrative of terror so much as of ongoing habitation. Anna still scans hallways when she visits. She sometimes dreams of a silhouette with the bend of an old man's shoulders, leaning on a cane and humming. She is not sleeping in the house anymore. She keeps a small, framed photograph of the grandfather near her bed in the city, and when she moves it slightly, she says, "I am careful how I set it down." The presence, however one names it, had taught her to treat certain rooms like living things, with respect, with soft speech, with the occasional light left on. The story of a man who might be watching over a home ends with a question more than an answer. Do these visitations arise from love, from memory, or from something that simply refuses to leave? Either way, the family changed its habits because of it. A house can act like a human, holding on to the weight of a life's habits. From a home where a grandfather lingers, we cross to stories of the wide, wild world, maritime legends, campfires, and a young traveler who carried the uncanny like a rucksack. This next set of accounts came to me via a single submitter named Lucas, but one of them I asked a friend to tell in his voice. Our guest narrator, Fear Street, takes the next piece, because the sea and the night belong to storytellers with different timbres. Take it away, Fear Street. Fear Street, voice. Lucas grew up with a longing for horizons. He slept in tents and spent a summer living on other people's porches, flashlight wedged under his jaw, as if the light itself could map the edges of the world. One night while crossing a channel on a small ferry, fog heavy and the boat's railing slick with salt, Lucas says he saw a ship that should not have been there. It rode the water like a phantom, sails like sheets pulled tight by no wind, lanterns hung along its rigging that burned with a sickly green fire. The crew, when visible, were only silhouettes, moving in stiff, ritual motions. The ferry's radio screamed static. A seasoned sailor muttered the old stories about the Flying Dutchman, a ship said in maritime lore to be doomed to sail the seas forever, a spectral omen for sailors. Lucas watched it as if the whole thing were a trick of fatigue, and then, in a heartbeat, the shape pitched back into the fog and vanished. He told the ferry crew in a rough, laughing voice to hide his unease. They nodded, as sailors will when a youth says something tall. They have all seen things at sea that make common folk into believers. Lucas kept a photograph he'd taken on an old phone, a smear of light and shadow that, if you squinted, could be read like the idea of a ship. He still wakes sometimes with the taste of brine at the back of his throat, and when the horizon is too smooth, he feels a small, upward tug in his chest. There are legends that travel faster than facts. The Flying Dutchman, in maritime lore, is a ship said to be doomed to sail the oceans for eternity, an omen sailors have feared for centuries. Lucas's sighting did not confirm a myth. It did, however, place him within that old geography of fear and wonder. Fear Street, voice. Another night, around a campfire in a clearing far from cell towers, Lucas and two friends watched a shape move in the trees. It was high and too thin for a human, too quick for ordinary animals, and it seemed to study them with an intelligence that was not animal. They whispered the word Wendigo because the folklore of North America includes tales of insatiable, gaunt beings associated in some versions with cold and hunger. The figure bent close to their firelight, then pulled back like a predator deciding whether to step into a play. They heard bones crack like branches, a noise that was not the wind, and one of the friends swore a long, thin shadow slipped between the oaks and out of sight. Lucas tells it like a person who cannot entirely trust his own eyes. He does not claim to have been chased. He claims to have been watched long enough to feel the marrow of himself go cold. They left the site with their fire banked and their voices small. Later, when the story was told around other fires, someone produced a field guide and named an animal. Someone else remembered an indigenous tale. Lucas, respectful of the provenance of these legends, does not try to co-opt them. He uses the word Wendigo the way people use names of notions, an attempt to give shape to a feeling of being hollowed out by an intelligence. We will note, briefly and respectfully, that the Wendigo is a figure in certain indigenous traditions, often associated with winter, hunger, and moral warnings. It is not a generic monster you can pluck from folklore without context. Lucas meant the word as a shorthand for the uncanny they experienced, and he used it cautiously. Fear Street, voice. Then comes the mountain house in Montana, the one Lucas rented cheaply for a week while trying to write. The place had thin walls and an old stove that coughed at night. Early on, a lamp blinked off by itself. Later, his phone call cut to static, and then, in the middle of a late-night video chat with a friend, the screen filled with a whisper, the sound of voices layered beneath the static, speaking syllables that might have been names. An object on the table slid 2 inches toward the edge and stopped, as if something had brushed its corner. You could call it interference, Lucas said in his submission. But then you feel it, like someone moving around your things when you're not watching. He filmed some of it, grainy footage of a door swinging when no wind could have reached it, and of a lamp that would not stay lit more than 3 minutes at a time. Once, the television, unused and plugged into the wall, turned itself onto a channel none of the local stations carried, snow and a faint voice. When he tried to record the voice on his phone, the software produced a broken file that played back as a slide of clicks and a low, rhythmic breathing. Lucas's house was not malevolent in clear ways. It was intrusive. He felt watched, as if his pens and cups reported to an unseen inventory. He left after a week, with boxes half-packed and a journal of short-clipped entries. He says he did not know whether his departure was cowardice or prudence. He still posts pictures of wide skies to his followers, the sort of content that implies freedom. Beneath the images sometimes, he leaves a small comment about being careful where you sleep. When I asked him what the encounters did to him, he said, "They remind you that the world holds more kinds of presence than the ones you invite." He keeps a small charm now, a length of string tied at the wrist, partly because it feels like a boundary, and partly because habit is one of the few things that settles a traveler's nervous heart. Back in my chair, I noted the way Lucas's stories stitch maritime myth and woodland terror to domestic unease. The uncanny moves easily between a ship's deck and a rented room. We carry thresholds with us, and sometimes the boarders find us when we sleep or set the kettle on the stove. We shift now to our final submission of the night, a sudden raw cry that ripped across a terrace and a temple where a stranger's hand both steadied and disappeared. This one comes from a listener in India, submitted by Priya, and it blends the public space of a street with the intimate ritual of a temple queue. It was a night in an old quarter where houses leaned toward each other like neighbors sharing secrets. Priya wrote of narrow lanes, the smell of incense that always hangs in the air near the temple, and a terrace that looked down over the street. She had fallen asleep on the terrace sometimes in the dry months, wrapped in a sheet while watching the stars twitch like distant fires. On this particular evening, she was up late with a cousin, sipping sweet tea and talking quietly, when a scream tore the air a block away, raw, human, and ricocheting between walls. The scream was followed by a guttural voice that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was not language she could place easily. It sounded like a sound torn somewhere between a human throat and something older. The streetlights blinked. Dogs howled and then fell silent. People rushed out of doorways, faces alight with lamps. Priya and her cousin ran down, joining a small crowd that collected like a slow, curious tide. There, near a temple courtyard, a man lay in the dust, shaking as if seized by a fit. Around him neighbors circled, and someone spoke the name of a local deity, as if invoking an old grammar of protection. A stranger appeared in the crowd, an older man who was in line for the temple darshan, a whispered word for a brief sighting of the deity. He stepped forward and put a hand on Priya's shoulder, his palm cool and steady. His voice, when he spoke, was a calm that threaded through the chaos, and he guided the man to a seated position. Priya remembers the hand as firm and purposeful, like a lever moved gently. The older man led a whispered chant, and then, as the ritual continued, he seemed to dissolve. Literally, the moment he turned to face the temple, he stepped into the queue, and then simply was not there when they blinked. Priya looked beside her in a panic. The line had not shifted. The man was gone. There are, of course, many possible explanations. Perhaps the elder was a devotee who moved on. Perhaps he had family in the crowd. Perhaps the pressure of bodies moved him out of sight. Priya relays the event with humility and no need to convert the listener to belief. She writes that afterward, people argued about what had happened. Some said the temple had its own protectors. Others, that crowd adrenaline and the shape of the night manufactured a savior in a way that made everybody feel safer. Priya includes a small cultural note. Many temples have long-standing traditions of elders and volunteers shepherding those in need, and in communities the line between the secular and the sacred can be thin. She asked me to note that when she said, "A hand steadied me," she meant the literal warmth of a stranger. When she says the hand disappeared, she means only that she turned at a moment, and the man was not where she expected him to be. She offers the detail without dramatizing it. What lingered for Priya was not a conviction that the man was a spirit, but a strangeness at how quickly comfort can be given and then vanish. The man's brief presence left her with gratitude, and the persistent question of whether the assistance came from a fellow human or from something else that sometimes, in tightly woven places, chooses to step in. She returns to that terrace sometimes, to the lintel and the small crack in the wall where a vine grows, and she leaves an extra cup of tea out in the morning for the cats as a gesture of ordinary kindness that might perhaps return an ordinary kindness in some other form. Her aftermath is practical and small. She no longer sleeps on the terrace without company, and she sometimes slips a cloth into her pocket when she goes out at night, an instinct born of vulnerability. The story closes not with a revelation, but with the unsettled gratitude of someone who felt assisted and then left to wonder whether that assistance had come from a neighbor or from the thin seam between the living and whatever else shares their streets. We have now crossed 10 thresholds: hotel closets, sleeping alcoves, family bedrooms, shadow figures, service corridors, mansion basements, seaside houses, grandfather's rooms, maritime fog, and temple queues. Each tale was submitted by a listener, each presented as a claimed account rather than adjudicated truth. What ties them is not a single explanation, but a catalogue of ways we inhabit the uncanny, objects that move, places that remember, people who arrive and vanish, and the stubborn fact that sleep is a border we cross every night. After these accounts, what remains is the residue, how people cope. Some move rooms, some install lamps, some make offerings, some bring charms, and some simply learn to live with a little more caution. These are ordinary tactics against an extraordinary set of experiences. They do not prove anything. They do not need to. They simply show how resilient and inventive humans are at carving security out of a world that sometimes breaches the expected. I'm grateful to everyone who sends these stories. Elena, Mika, the family in Oroto, Pau, Irina, the guest from Arnouveau, the family on the cliff in France, Anna, Lucas, and Priya. Thanks as well to Fear Street for lending a voice that matched the sea. If this collection has left you with a chill, a question, or a memory of your own night, know that you are not alone. If you have a story you want to submit, something that woke you in the dark, that made you check a doorway twice, there's a place to send it. The details are in the episode notes. One small ask before we part. If these kinds of deep dives into the uncanny interest you, consider subscribing and sharing the channel. There are more nights to come, more doors to open. Your support keeps these submissions alive and helps others find voices for their strange personal encounters. Finally, a note to carry home. The uncanny rarely arrives with a label. It appears in the sounds that the house won't explain, in the pressure on a mattress, in the way a gurney seems to remember being occupied. It is not always malevolent. Sometimes it is memory, sometimes it is misfired physics, sometimes it is something else, and whatever it is, it leaves traces, habits acquired, lamps left on, a chair placed gently in front of a wardrobe. Live lightly with these stories. Treat your thresholds with a small kindness, and as you turn off your light tonight, listen. Maybe the house is speaking in a language you do not know. Maybe it is just the house. Maybe it is something that wanted to be seen.